Hi guys, and happy lunch. I'm glad to see a few people are eating. I know it's been a long morning. And see a couple faces from yesterday as well, which is great. Yesterday, same time session around noon called After You Hit Submit, which was like a 201 to this. This is sort of our 101 or foundational or fundamental talk on this subject today. So by way of background, my name is Ngaruiya. I'm on faculty in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the Yale School of Medicine. And we're really excited to be here chatting with all of you with a variety of different colleagues with really interesting backgrounds that you'll get to hear about in terms of how we ended up with our funding, some of our successes and challenges, and hopefully things that you can learn from today. So why the title, Zero to Hero? Well, like some of you in the room, and you are so welcome and so comfortable, this is a safe space to be here, I was probably the least informed and the most clueless about NIH and federal funding just a few short years ago. I'm so proud and excited to say that for the past 2 years I've been top 100 in EM nationally, and that's to say that that can be you too, okay? Didn't have the traditional like K route, hand-holding, someone coaching me through this process to get my first R grant, submit my first 2 R01s this year, but again, it's possible. And so we brought together this awesome team to hopefully share their own experiences too on how they got to that. So while we'll be going through a significant number of hopefully key slides to be able to get you to a level of at least saying, I can get out of here and understand what these terms are and engage with the NIH alphabet soup. We'll also have periodic times for questions, so please be sure to ask questions as well. This is our mandatory disclosure slide. And so our agenda today will be to start with introductions, so you get to know all the lovely people on stage. We'll go over some key terminology, different types of funding mechanisms. We'll have a little game, hopefully at the end, to kind of bring it all together for you, called Find the Info-amation. We'll conclude and then take any questions. So by way of intros, skipping ahead. By way of intros, you've heard a little bit about me, my origin story. My initial grant was on what's called an NIH R21. That's more of a pilot type of grant. I have 2 of them currently on the finishing tail end of them, and 2 R01s that are under review currently. I have a number of foundation and institutional funding as well, and I will be sharing more about that later. I'm going to turn over to, you can just go in order, Dr. Guirhis, Faheem.
Yeah, my name is Faheem Guirhis. I am at University of Florida. I'm a sepsis researcher, and my first funding was an internal grant for about $10,000, followed by a society grant, and then a K grant. And it took me quite a while to sort of figure out that path. It took me 5-6 years to work on a K and kind of get into the NIH thing. So I'm happy to share about that experience and happy to be here today.
Sabbatini. I'm a professor at University of Washington and a health services and policy researcher. I also got my start with a smaller Blue Cross Blue Shield grant for about $10,000 in Michigan, and then pivoted that to an EMF grant in health policy, and then had a K-12 internal training opportunity. I have an interesting story. Did the traditional K-08 submission to ARC and scored in the 7th percentile, and they did not fund it. And so then I was able to pivot to a couple R grants, I think very luckily.
And we will be talking about R01s tomorrow. So for specific R01 questions, we'll go through a lot of that tomorrow, but you're welcome to ask any question at any time. Please feel free to shout it out. So I'm Elizabeth Schoenfeld. I'm at UMass Bay State. I did an ultrasound fellowship first, and then I did a research fellowship, and then I started applying for a K award. But I actually got an R03 before I got my K award through quite a bit of help and mentorship and a grant writing team that was amazing. So I had an R03, and then I applied for the institutional K and the K08 at the same time, also from ARC, and I got them both, but obviously you take the longer K. There are ARC, AHRQ, if you don't know those initials, it's something that we will touch on, has some similar to NIH, but has some substantial challenges. I don't know, is anyone from ARC here? before I talk about ARC. But we'll get into some of those differences and challenges. And then in the past year or so, I've submitted an R01 and an R34, and we will go through what all of that means.
Thanks so much, guys. So as you can see, there's an including in the room. There are a million ways to skin a cat, and we'll love to hear from some of you as well in your experiences. But for a second, we want to hear about some of you heroes out there as well. So just by way of hand, so we kind of know who's in the room, who do we have here that is a medical student? Any medical students by chance? I love that. Well, she's also helping, so thank you. Thank you for being here. And what about residents? You have a fair enough couple residents. Good, excellent for being here. You'll hear a little bit more about K's soon. Fellows, maybe. Okay, close, yeah. And then faculty, like, obviously all faculty probably. Okay, anyone that's applied for a grant, any kind of grant? Okay, a lot of people, great. Okay, so we're talking to like a well-versed room. Anyone who's applied to a federal grant? Yeah, NIH, yeah, okay, good, perfect. And successfully gotten a grant? Okay, good. So we know that we're dealing with a fairly well-versed room, but again, don't be intimidated. This is the room to feel safe to ask any question. There is no question that is too silly. If there was a question that you felt that was silly, I had it back then. So with that, I'm gonna be turning over to my colleague.
All right. So we're going to run through kind of the basics of all the different agencies and go through sort of the different titles that different investigators get. So I'm going to run you all through that. It's an alphabet soup, as you all know. The federal government likes initials for things. Kind of reminds you of doing your taxes. It's all these different things that are sort of hard and opaque and not very clear to people who are applying. So the first thing we're going to get into is who are the funders and kind of the common funding body nomenclatures. Then we're going to get into what do they call you? What is the name that they refer to scientists, all the different roles on the project. There's numerous different roles that you can have, from being the lead on the project to being a consultant or a co-investigator. So we'll go through those specifics as well. We'll talk about the different funding body staff. So who are the people that you're going to interface with as you're trying to get funding? And then what do you call the funding? So what are the different mechanisms? What do they do? What are they used for? Who should be applying? What kind of level of experience is required for them? And then the people that sort of decide who gets the funding. So all of those are pretty important pieces of embarking on this. So the common funding body agencies, you've probably heard of most of these, but NIH obviously is the biggest one that goes around and people know about. AHRQ, as Elizabeth mentioned, another very big one. NSF, and I'll just kind of put them all up here. These are probably the biggest ones that people go after in terms of federal funding agencies, and they all have their nuances. And so the experience around applying for these different funding mechanisms is really can be a little bit different. But these are the main ones that people go after. There's other ones that aren't up here as well, as Patient-Centered Outcomes and Research Institute, like PCORI, that's a big one. Also BARDA, which is a biomedical agency for defense, something like that. There's more than this, but these are some of the bigger ones that you'll hear about and that we're going to discuss. So getting into NIH, what you're going to hear sort of referred to as institutes or centers, right? So when you apply to NIH, you don't apply to the broad agency, right? You apply to a specific institute or center, and you're going to target your application to a specific institute or center. And the institute or center, really their role is they're the organizational component within the National Institutes of Health, which are 27 different institutes or centers, right? So you're going to pick one of those and you're going to engage with that. And so they're sort of the organizational component of a particular area of research. You're also going to talk to people at that specific institute or center about your application, right? So as you're thinking about where does this go, is this a good fit? And we'll talk about the different roles of the people, like program officers, scientific contacts, et cetera. But those are the people that you're going to want to talk to figure out if your project is a good fit for that particular institute. Here are all the different institutes. And you can see how they organize NIH. So you start with the Office of the Director, followed by all the different institutes, and then you can see at the bottom the Center for Scientific Review. So when you submit an application, CSR is really who figures out who reviews your application. So those are all the different study sections that you hear about. That's organized usually by CSR. And then there's some other things as well. They have their own clinical center and an IT center as well. So like I mentioned, 27 different centers. And these are some of the bigger funded ones. And, if you look at, you can actually find all of this, it's all public knowledge, but you can look at amounts of money that each of these different ICs have. Some have more, some have less. These are some of the more well-funded, bigger ones, and some of the more common ones that emergency medicine investigators will apply for. NHLBI being fairly large, NIMHD, NIDA is a big one. A couple that aren't up here are NINDS is another big one that funds emergency care research, right? So these are some of the more well-known and kind of more funded. And then also Fogarty is the international one. So if you're going for international funding, Fogarty is that specific IC.
I want to add one thing, that it is relevant to look up how well they are funded and what their funding lines are, because often you have a project that fits in one or more of these. So for example, recently when I started working on my R01, it fit really well in AHRQ, and I was sort of excited to go the AHRQ route. And then I said, you know what, it actually fits in NIMHD. Let me compare funding. And I opened up and I compared funding, and I was like, oh, wow, like NIMHD has way more funding than ARC does, and the R01 is a different size, and it makes more sense for me to go to that. So if your project fits in more than one institute, it makes sense to take a look at the two different institutes, both in terms of funding and in terms of mission and other things that we're going to talk about.
And I'll just add one other thing, which is that, number one, I work in global health. I know there are a couple people in the room because I recognize you who work in global health. Fogarty is our institute. It's actually one of the least funded institutes or centers. And so, which we'll harp on later, it's important that you talk with your PO, like we talked about yesterday, to help figure out where you might fit or what two types of institutes or centers you might fit in. And also being aware that just because you fit into one doesn't necessarily mean that's where all your funding is going to come from. In fact, none of my work has been funded by Fogarty to date. So we'll keep going.
No, that's a great point. And I think, just to add to those, I think the conversations around where your grant should go are really important, right? You're going to talk to the people at these different ICs and discuss what you're talking about. A lot of times they'll want to see an AIMS page, and they'll want to know exactly what it is you're trying to, propose to them. And then they'll tell you, yeah, this sort of matches what we do, or this doesn't really fit very well. They don't always say it that clearly, though. But the conversations are important. So you'll notice that there isn't an emergency medicine institute, right? There is an emergency care institute. Even though we do research that falls into a lot of different institutes, there isn't one that's a specific home for the kind of work that happens in the emergency department or that we're interested in. But don't fret. There is an Office of Emergency Care Research, and that's led by Dr. Jeremy Brown. And they actually are there specifically for the purpose of sort of receiving emergency medicine, helping to promote emergency care research. Again, not an institute, but so really what's the role of the Office of Emergency Care Research? They catalyze development of new funding opportunities. So they have involvement a while back, and I'm not sure that it's still up, but there was an NOT specifically for interest in emergency care research and that you could actually use when you're putting in an application that sort of raises the priority as it fits one of these specific notices. And so that's something you actually can put in your application. So they sort of catalyze those opportunities. They help to coordinate between different institutes and centers, like for example, things like Siren, NINDS, NHLBI, working together to make networks happen. That's something that also is sort of coordinated through their office. They create opportunities and they sort of connect researchers, so sort of figure out synergy between different investigators and doing work. And then they also foster career and career development opportunities for emergency care research. So I'm going to... So again, Dr. Jeremy Brown, you can take a picture of this slide if you want, but this is his information, and or you can just Google it. But that's the number to call if you have questions about what you're doing and how their office can be of help. All right. So I'm going to move on to what's the term used to refer to scientists. So. The biggest one is, the first one you're going to want to know about is the principal investigator. What makes somebody a principal investigator? So really it's somebody who's got the experience and the training to sort of lead a project, right? You need to be the project lead. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as a program director, but NIH will sometimes refer to it as that, but the principal investigator is really the person who's leading the project and has the skills, training, expertise to do so. Early stage investigator is a super important thing, and something I would recommend anybody capitalize on. And essentially what it means is that you're within the past 10 years of finishing your terminal degree or your last fellowship or training for a clinician, which most of us. If you did a fellowship, for example, after residency, that would be your sort of terminal training, and that's when the 10 years starts. Importantly, you can get extensions for significant family life events like childbirth, sick relatives. You do have to apply, and you have to apply in the terms of the number of months that you're trying to get an extension for. So if you're at 10 years but you had 2 kids, you could potentially apply to get additional time to extend that. And why is it so important? So, the last study section I was in, there were 12 ESI applications and 40 non-ESI applications. And they have to review the top 50%, right? So if there's 12 ESI applications, 6 get reviewed, discussed, and scored. If there's 40 non-ESI, only 20 of them get scored and discussed, right? So you're in a much smaller pot, and you're in a slightly less competitive group, and so it's a huge advantage to be considered an ESI. And the reason they have that status is because they want to fund young investigators who are proposing new work, and getting their work started for them. So it's a really, really big advantage.
Does anyone have any questions? Everyone always has questions.
Yeah, so to my understanding, ESI, they actually put them in a separate pile.
Mhm.
Wow, that's a huge advantage, actually. I didn't know that.
Yes, it's huge. And also, if you are considering MPI applications, if you go on with somebody who's not an ESI, you lose your status if you get funded, right?
MPI is multiple.
Sorry. Sorry. If you and somebody else go in, it's called MPI, as a multiple principal investigator application. You'll lose your status if they're not also an ESI, right? So it's something to consider when you're thinking about collaborative work, because we all want to do that. Go ahead.
What's the intersection between being an ESI and going for a training grant?
Oh.
Everyone who goes for a training grant be an ESI?
Yeah, so you only lose your ESI status if you're the PI of an R or a similar type of project grant. K grants are allowed.
Yeah, an ESI status is specifically giving you an advantage against other independent investigators.
For an R01,
So
for like
you-
R level.
Yeah, you got to be, well, only R01 too, not the smaller Rs. So you also have to be mindful of your ESI time clock if you're going for a K award, because that could time you out.
Except there's a nice little caveat there. It's that your last degree. So so for me, I didn't do an official research fellowship, but I did a master's of clinical research when I was junior faculty. So I reset my ESI clock when I finished my master's in 2017. And as a person who finished residency in 2009, that's a big deal. So I gave myself 8 extra years of ESI by getting a master's. And I've had friends who did a bunch of master's classes but said, well, what do I need the master's for? And it's like, well, the master's will reset your ESI clock. So that's something to consider if you're doing classes and you decide whether or not you're going to fully get that master's or not get that master's, particularly if you're post-fellowship and post-residency, or you started a research career later, you get to restart your ESI clock when you get that clinical science degree. Yes?
Okay, so let's say like I finished my fellowship, my residency, my master's degree, 10 years ago, I didn't apply for an ESI for that. I was an R1, I was an MPI. And then I decide, I'm gonna get my doctorate in something else, or I'm gonna get another master's degree. Does that reset the clock? Or
I believe it
I'm not
does, but I
sure.
don't know the
As
nuance.
long as you haven't had an R1. Like, so if you went MPI with someone,
Right.
that's
My-
your R1.
The whole point is to get you that, essentially that R01. So the clock is, you're done once you get an R01. But the R21s and the R03s, which we'll go through the nuances of those in a little bit, you don't lose your ESI status for those.
Yeah, so and importantly, you guys mentioned independent investigator status is really having an R01 type level of funding, right? So mentored awards, which we were referring to before, K awards don't change that. Yes.
I noticed it says postgraduate clinical training. Does a research fellowship count?
Yes.
It does.
Mm-hmm. I think so. Doesn't it? Not unless you get a degree? Sorry, okay, I'll stand corrected on that one.
But just remember, you can still apply even without the ASI, because you're gonna write awesome grants and get awesome scores and get them award anyway, right? It's just, we're just emphasizing it because it's important, it gives you like a little bit of a handicap, for lack of a better word, and like golf handicap. So, if you can take advantage of it, do, but it's not like you're not gonna get funded, just.
And also, there is something called new investigator status, which also gives you an extra little bit of a leg up. So if you're not an ESI, but you fall under new investigator status, that actually gives you an advantage as well. And I'm not sure quite how that works quite as well, but it is there, and it's something to take advantage of also.
Not that I would, but if someone was to apply for multiple R01s and it hadn't been scored, are you choosing what is going to be your ESI status, or not all?
Yes.
Yeah, all of them. If you do it simultaneously, you put it on all of them. Yeah, because you don't lose the status till it's funded. Once it's funded, then you've lost it. You only get to use it once, right? I'm going to keep going so I can keep us on track, but we'll come back to that if we need to. So co-investigator, this is somebody who's an individual involved with the PI in kind of executing or coming up with the project, but isn't necessarily the project lead. Sometimes we refer to them as collaborators, and they are a lot of times from the same organization, but they can also be from other organizations as well. Consultants, usually people who are sort of from the outside. That's kind of how you distinguish consultant versus collaborator. A lot of times it's from a different institution from the one that's doing the main application, and they're usually providing you like a service, like a specific thing that you need to conduct the project, like a test or maybe just something that you sort of contract out to them. And so those are consultants, and usually they are paid as well. Other significant contributors, probably the clearest example of this would be mentors, who are mentors on, say, a career development awarder, and don't have measurable effort, but they are contributing in the sense that they're providing their time to mentor somebody on a K or something. That's probably the best example, and I'm sure there's other things that fall into that as well, but that's a term that gets thrown around. Key personnel. So really, the PI and the people who are contributing to the development or execution of the project are considered key personnel. All of these people require biosketches. Biosketches are a whole nother discussion, but they are something where essentially you have to put in almost a scientific version of their CV into the application. So anybody who's considered key personnel needs a biosketch on the application as well. They do have to devote some measurable effort, whether you're putting it in the budget or not, right? So they may not get necessarily funding for their time, but they have to actually commit that effort, and it may be an in-kind contribution of their effort also. Go ahead.
We'll get to this later, but does the mentor have to be at the same institution?
No.
K Awards, there will be a 4 p.m. discussion of K Awards in room Lone Star C. So if you want to talk more detailed about K Awards, we will be there to talk about that. Does anyone have any more questions on these roles or figuring?
Statistician is the key personnel.
Depends.
Or co-I. I
Yeah.
think my statistician is often a co-I.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it depends how you want to write them in. If you're going to hire them as a staff, like they're a research scientist kind of statistician, then they can be staff and they are not key personnel. If you work with them and they happen to be more of like a methods co-investigator for your grant, then you would write them in. It really depends how you see their role. Are they going to supervise the design and execution, or are they going to be doing the grunt work? That's part of it. And so I think, it really just depends.
And the implication on the back end is that if that person were to leave your grant for some reason, would that affect you being able to complete your science? And they will, thank you very much, they will assess that. Like if, I don't know, you have a conflict with somebody in a team, or they leave your institution and can no longer work on your project, you actually have to write to NIH about that if a key personnel is leaving your team. So that's just something to think about in terms of who you're going to list as your key personnel, as to whether they need to be or they can, not be. The other thing I wanted to add, do you want to add to that point?
Yeah, I was just going to say, the people whose biosketches look great really add to your grant, and the biosketch has a narrative in the beginning where they explain what they're doing and why they're excited about your grant and your thing. So if there's somebody who has lots of previous biosketches because they're on lots of grants, then you want their biosketch there. But if they are, we have a lot of people who do different stats at our department. If they're just doing basic analyses that are not that interesting or not that hard, and they are not NIH funded as co-investigators on previous grants, then their biosketch doesn't actually add that much, and they're just doing more of sort of basic biostatistics for you, then you don't necessarily need them on the grant. Certainly, if you're doing anything interesting statistically, you probably are going to want somebody who says, well, yes, I have a history of doing. I have done cluster randomized trials. I have done propensity scores. These are the grants that I've been on before, and then they're a key personnel with a biosketch.
It's interesting because I got a summary statement that one of the dings was that the statistician wasn't on as personnel.
I was going to add to that, which might build on this comment of like using consultants versus like co-Is. So again, I work in global health, which is mired with challenges in getting people listed as co-Is because they're at these institutions that like don't know how to do budgets and like just mired. So the way I've gone around it, and this may be helpful to the global health people in the room, is adding key personnel as consultants. So that way I'm also promoting them and their science and their ability to contribute, and listing them as key personnel because they are, without having to go through some of the logistical nightmare of what's sometimes entailed by adding a co-I from the institutional aspect of it. The other piece of that is those who are working like with indigenous populations or like other underserved communities that may be in like nonprofit organizations that like just can't do the lift to come on as a co-I, if that helps frame it a little bit too. So, and I'll add one other piece. I try to buff up what I think is buffing up, and it seems to have worked well, buff up the application with having a letter from, like, you have to have a letter from the key personnel as well. So they'll be able to explain that there. They'll be able to explain at the top of their bio, like Elizabeth said. And you have a section in your grant that's called the investigator section. You might know, you look like you've submitted grants before, right? And you can also buff it up there too. So you can explain it in a lot of different ways, and hopefully, as a preamble, your PO also knows who you are, and you can talk through that with them as well. So,
I think just to piggyback off your comments, so you have to be thoughtful about your team. I've sat on a lot of NIH study sections. Probably what you're hearing with that comment is more that there was, your application, didn't instill confidence enough that the rest of the team, had the statistical expertise, is really what you're hearing from that, rather than any title, or that there was maybe questions about how integrated that statistician would be part of the team. So sometimes it's just a grantsmanship thing, to be honest.
Amber.
I think something that was left a little bit unsaid. So the co-investigator, we don't talk a lot about budgets. The co-investigator is a subcontract if they're not at your institution. A subcontract means that your SPA, your Sponsored Programs Administration, needs to start the subcontract process early. There's like contracts, there's like all this logistical stuff that you don't do, someone's gonna help you with. But a consultant is actually much easier. So if you have an expert in the field that maybe you know from SAEM and you want their help, you can either subcontract their institution, pain in the butt, or they can say, listen, you don't need me for that much of my time. I'll write a letter. I'll be a consultant. I'll consult for 20 hours this year. You'll pay me out of the grant as a consultant at $150 an hour. So I think and that I don't have the answer of whether the consultant helps your grant more or less than the co-I, but if the grant is smaller and you don't have the money, or you don't want to deal with a subcontract, then the consultant might make more sense. There's other instances when you have a subcontract, the indirect rate goes to them and not to you, so your institution loses money the more subcontracts that you have, so your institution cares about that. And then on top of that, if you have AHRQ, where your indirects are counted in the cap of the grant, if that institution has higher indirects than your institution, then you lose additional money based on more subcontracts. So very complicated.
And I would say, in general, don't try to put someone who's going to be playing a co-investigator type of role, like they're bringing in heavy expertise and it's critical to kind of the team, and try to write them in as a consultant to save money. That will hurt you. That has come up in multiple study sections. So consultants generally, like on my last R01, I wrote in a consultant who had a specific expertise around an instrument that we were going to use in a survey. It was like very discrete expertise, very small part. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna present a couple slides here. Okay. All right, I'll go fast through this. So who's your program officer? So this is your key person at the NIH. They are very important, and they are more important in some institutes and less important in other institutes. So some institutes have a pay line, and I've had interactions with POs who are very standoffish, and it didn't affect the funding at all, depending, because they don't score the applications. And I've had other institutes where it is critical that the PO is in your court, or else that grant won't get funded if it's a borderline score. So really important person. The main reason you will talk to a PO, and anytime you're expecting to submit a grant, you probably should at least reach out and have a half-an-hour conversation saying, these are my aims. And most of the time they'll be like, yeah, we're interested in this. Sometimes you'll get some interesting information about like, well, we're also really interested in this angle, and you can kind of build that into your aims. The scientific review officer is who takes over after you've submitted your application. So this is the person who runs the study section. I've never actually had to contact this person, but apparently you can. And I think the reason that you would potentially contact this person, and I've seen this happen with colleagues, so there's a lot of potential study sections that your grant could get referred to. And if it's the wrong one or you have concerns, you would reach out to your SRO and be like, do you have the expertise on your study section to do this? Apparently you can suggest specific expertise is needed to review your application, and you can probably use them to get it reassigned. Okay. So this is just the timeline. Talk to your PO before you submit. The SRO takes over. That'll probably be opaque, and you'll probably never talk to them. And then once you have a score, if it's a fundable score, you'll re-engage your PO.
Can I ask a quick question? Does your PO introduce your application? No.
No, and again, sometimes they can be really helpful and they give you little keys about what the institute's looking for. Other times they're just like, yep, sounds good. And they're not helpful at all. So it really just depends. Like NIMH and NIDA don't use pay lines, and so those POs are really important. NHLBI uses pay lines. You basically just have to score good enough in study section. Okay, so I kind of talked about that, so I'll just skip through this. I'm going to pass it off to Christina. I'll talk to you again. Thank you for asking. Yes. Many institutes will say, we will pay out the grant, any grant that scores below this percentile. So let's say it's 15th percentile, 12th percentile, and yes, those are the numbers. So if you score below pay line, if your score comes back and it's 14th percentile and the pay line was 15th percentile, it will be funded.
But
For the most part.
Amber mentioned with her AHRQ, sometimes it doesn't matter. So she had a 7th percentile and AHRQ didn't. And so, because they don't do pay lines, right? So you actually get your score and you get your percentile often, not always, right after the scientific review group meeting, and you have a sense of how it is. However, so I got a score recently and I said, oh, that's a pretty good score. How come there's no percentile written there? And I called the PO and she said, because we don't do pay lines, so there's no percentile. And I was like, damn it. So it gives you some information, but it depends on the institute.
All right, so moving right ahead, so we try to get through these slides at least for you guys. What do you call the people who decide whether you get funding? We don't really call them, but friend? I don't know, not quite. But we had a session yesterday talking a little bit about after you hit submit, the stages of review. So you can look at those slides if you missed it yesterday. I see a couple faces in the room, so maybe grab them afterwards as well. Just really quickly, in terms of the flow of the stages of review that your grant will go through after you submit it, the first stage is what's called a scientific review group, or SRG. This is a group of members who've been appointed, usually for multiple years, sometimes ad hoc, depending on expertise. So a few temporary members sometimes. As was sort of being gotten at, I think, with that question, is the level of representation varies very highly. I've had people that are vets, basic scientists, statisticians who are very anal about having a statistician on your grant, frankly, from a grantsmanship standpoint, as a key personnel. And so it's understanding that you need to write for a diversity of people in the room. And actually, when you're putting your grant together, to consider having someone outside of your specialty, and frankly, sometimes even outside of medicine, consider reading your grant to see its level of understandability, relatability, and understanding on level of generalizability of your work. EM is unfortunately often underrepresented. I know there's a similar sense within the group. In each study section I've sat on, I was either the only EM person, one of two in one, or like myself and like a trauma surgeon. So, so understand, as much as we are the redheaded stepchild and misunderstood in a lot of rooms, you need to write accordingly again to demonstrate how generalizable and impactful your work will be, not just for science in general, but also for that institute. This is an example of what an SRG looks like, and it's just to show that these are peers, right? So they're people who are other scientists like you who are going to score it first based on its quality of science, its rigor, and like I said, its impact. And they're actually given a benchmark and guideline for how to score that you can actually see in your own in the RFA or the PA, the announcement for the grant. It's usually towards the bottom of that grant.
Dean, do you get to pick your SRG?
I'm going to talk about that. So one of the interesting things and tools that I've learned as I've gotten more experience with this is the key, thanks for the probe, the importance of considering selecting your SRG as you submit or the scientific review group. I had a grant that was discussed twice, had a like decent percentile score, but like the SRG just wasn't quite getting it. And we would talk with our PO and she's like, you know, I think you just need a different scientific review group because this group assesses like studies that are pre-implementation for internal validity, and we were not doing internal validity, so we were not talking about that. We were talking about external validity, and in our subsequent resubmission, we've sent it to a different SRG. If that's not something that like is landing for you quite yet, if you talk with your PO, they'll help you understand that, but just ask them when you do talk with them, do you have a recommendation for a scientific review group that I could pick from? And there's like a mission and who the people are on that group prospectively to be able to put in as you submit your grant. Quick question?
Do the members of the SRG greatly vary year to year?
So there's usually it's a great question. So there are fixed or standing scientific review groups or SRGs or scientific committees. There are others that are put together ad hoc. So I've always been part of ad hoc or special emphasis panels, we call them, because I'm in global health. So a lot of the announcements come out as RFPs, like just brand new idea programs or program ideas. But yeah, so there are some standing ones that, again, the role of the SRO and the chairman or chairwoman are to pull in appropriate people. Like if there's like a lot of EM submissions, to try to get a couple EM people on it. They're not always successful, depending on the pool, but it's just to know there are some standing, some are ad hoc. Okay, gonna keep going. The last second bit is to know there's something called a council or a board advisory review. This is a diverse group of individuals, both from science, usually very senior scientists, also from the community, might be from advocacy groups and so on, who after peer review will look at your grant where your PO can actually present you, okay? So your PO will actually go to this meeting and talk to this board and tell them, you know, contextualize your grant and who you are a little bit potentially for the council. But ultimately, their goal is to reconcile your work and your score in line with the mission and priorities for that institute or center. And this is just an example of that. Again, just to show you that you have people from like a variety of different aspects of life, and it's important to know that you're writing for a variety of different people. But it's also helpful to know that the US government is prioritizing different viewpoints in who they're funding and the impact of our work. Lastly, you will get reviewed by someone like, or at least get a final sign-off from somebody like Dr. Fauci. So each institute has a center director who looks or has a role like Dr. Fauci. And essentially over time, it's kind of cool to know that they get to know you as a scientist over time if you continue to get funding with them. There are director awards and so on. So just to frame that for you. Turn back over to Amber.
Okay, I'm going to go quickly through a couple of these slides. So we think about funding as a mechanism, which could be a grant, cooperative agreement, or contract. That's kind of what the federal government funds, with certain things like CDC funding predominantly contracts, and NIH funding grants. So the mechanism are these, so this is a grant mechanism, and you can see there's multiple activity codes like R, U, K, these are the activity codes, and then the program description, like R01 is research grants. So same kind of thing, programs, is it a grant program? Funding research, is it a training program? This is kind of, we can just skip that. And then the activity codes, like we said, within a program, like a research program, there's multiple activity codes. And those activity codes have different funding levels and requirements for preliminary data and so forth. All right. And these activity codes, which I've never seen before, are global health activity codes, but there's lots. All right. So I think kind of the important thing to think here is a funding announcement. So most people will apply to things like a parent award. So I have an idea and I will submit it to the parent program, like the R01 parent program, which is just an investigator-initiated research. But there's different types of funding announcements, including ones where they say, you know, we want research on this topic, and if you can find that, that is going to be a more effective grant mechanism for you. So program announcements tend to be the parent awards, like the R01 parent program, and all the institutes participate in that. Requests for applications, though, are the specific kind of research areas that maybe an institute is looking for, and it may only, you know, one institute or maybe just a handful of institutes participate in a single RFA. And then request for proposals is the same thing, but for contracts. Okay, let me just skip this. So this is an example of an RFA. So again, so the first thing you should do when you're thinking about your research idea after talking to your PO and figuring out your idea has some legs for the institute is also then take a look at your funding mechanism and say, is there a more specific RFA that this fits under or that I can tailor it to, because your chances of getting funded will be much better. A lot of times those are pulled into special emphasis panels and so forth. Okay. I'm going to skip that. And then a notice of special interest. So these are really great. So what it is it's basically telling you what a current strategic priority of an institute is, and it's not an actual funding announcement. Within a notice of special interest, they say, we're interested in this type of research, projects that do X, Y, Z, and these are the grant mechanisms that would fit under this notice of special interest.
And then you submit it under the parent for that?
You submit under one of the grant mechanisms that's participating. So recently I saw one about the HEAL initiative from NIDA, which is looking for issues around, there was one around issues around workforce for behavioral health and substance use disorders, for example. But then there was a few different grant mechanisms that you could potentially apply to. All right. So the key thing from here is, oh gosh, to consider the best fit place for your research. So you kind of have an idea of the institute. Unfortunately, we're at a disadvantage, as has been mentioned before, in emergency medicine because our research is often on a general population. So unless you are like, I research heart failure, you know, and you are going to the NHLBI, a lot of us have these cross-cutting issues. And it's a little bit of a, do you like my idea, but also how can I fit my idea to your interests? So there's a little bit of back and forth to actually get funded as an emergency medicine researcher. And the way you kind of figure out not just who the best institute, but how can I tailor this general idea to be more consistent with the institute is going to their mission and their strategic priorities. So let's see here. So these are strategic priority examples for NHLBI. And so what you would ideally do, and in many people, they will actually write in the impact statement or somewhere else that this grant targets NHLBI's strategic priority XYZ, and you call it out directly. And actually, that's like a good grantsmanship point. Anytime you can just say it and make it easy for the reviewer so they don't have to think, like, does this target to the priority is better. So be as explicit as possible. All right, and then I pass this off.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, questions?
Can you apply to like DOD and NIH SAEM?
On your other support page, it's going to ask about overlap. So if it's the same project, there will be overlap, and you'll have to report that. And so ideally, you'd want variations of the same project in aims, and so maybe there would only be partial overlap, but absolutely, people do that all the time.
What's that? All right. Jump in with questions anytime. So I think one thing I'm not sure we're totally clear, but you're looking through those FOAs and parent mechanisms first because the very bottom of the FOA tells you who the program officer is. So you're finding the correct program officer based on the FOA often. And so then you're sending your specific aims to that person and you're saying, hey, I read this and I think my idea fits. What do you think? And then you schedule a meeting and you talk about it. And that's essential. I mean, I've changed centers based on that for both my K and an R01, where they said, well, actually, that's not exactly what we're looking for, and it changes where you go. So I think you guys actually all know most of this stuff. This is sort of the basics. But an R01, like we said, is a large grant, clinical trial, implementation. It's not always a clinical trial, and you have to, all of the FOAs will say clinical trials included, clinical trials excluded, so make sure you're in the right place. It's usually, this is not 100%, it's usually a 5-year grant with a budget of $500,000 per year. But it can be greater if you submit an application that says that you actually need more money for something else. This is going to be from an experienced team, and you're often going to have some prelim data. Again, we'll talk about this tomorrow for people with specific questions. A K award is a training grant. It's usually a 4 to 5 year award. It helps a young investigator work on a large project with a mentor, but it's really about training that person, and there's limited funding for staff. So the R01 has lots of funding for people other than the PI, and the K award has funding for the PI and not other people. Yes?
The K grant, usually they want to see prelim data as well.
No.
Correct? Or no?
So you can, if you have some prelim data, that's lovely. It shows what you've done. It's lovely and good to show that you've started building a track record in an area. So if you have a paper or multiple papers that show that you are becoming an expert in an area, I think that looks good. But you don't have to say, listen, I've piloted my intervention and now I'm going for a K award. You're often building an intervention and piloting it in your K award, and then they can see how that K award is going to build to an R01. And you say that in your K award, that like, this is how I'm going to build to an R01. Yes?
Just one caveat to the K award, something that I've noticed is that a lot of the K awards want the mentors to have some significant funding, like an R01. That's one of the things that I had to struggle with. That's one for K awards.
Yeah, that's a great point. So thanks for bringing up some of these nuances. There are people, I once said to one of my colleagues that he was my mentor, and he said, I do not count as a successful mentor. So your mentors on paper for a K award need to have had other people that they have mentored in K awards. If you have 4 mentors and none of them have federal funding, you will not get funded. That they have to have federal funding because they are the people that know how you get there. Yes?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so your ideal K award mentor writes a letter of support that says, I am this really illustrious professor who has all these titles, and I have mentored X amount of K awardees, and this many have gone on to R01 funding. That is the ideal person, and that's a hard person to find unless you're at like a super large research institution. So there's other ways to do that. If you have a PhD mentor who, has like mentored lots and lots of PhDs coming through or something like that, but there has to be some demonstration that they have some significant mentoring chops and that they also have significant resources, both in, funding and staff and stuff, because you're going to be utilizing their infrastructure.
Yeah. So federal funding, ideally an R award or similar, and other previous K awardees who have gone on to get their Ks and ideally also have then gone on to get their Rs.
I'll just say one real quick thing. So yeah, active funding for the mentor is very helpful. And also, like was mentioned, you don't get a lot of money for research in a case. So generally, part of the reason you're having a mentor with active funding is because they sort of back you up, right? They may have resources, funds, a team that you can sort of utilize and play off of, and that is part of why that's so important.
Yes.
How important is it for the mentor to be at your same institution?
It's not essential, but you need to show that you can work with them and that you're going to make it work.
Primary mentor, yes.
The primary.
The primary mentor must be at your institution.
Must,
Yeah,
do you think?
Yeah.
Must? Okay.
Yeah.
But they do not have to be in your
I would-
department.
Well, okay, you can argue, yeah.
I'm not going to argue it, but I would say you have to be really careful with how you play distance mentors, right? So if they're seen as somebody that's critical, it's pretty tough to get by with. If you have somebody at your institution who has some of that expertise and you can sort of play up that in the bio sketches and show that they sort of can play some of that role, but you also have a distance person who's an expert, then it looks better. That might sound a little muddy, but there's some. strategy.
And they don't have to be EM for sure. And they often are not.
Definitely.
I think it would be a real red flag on an application if someone didn't have a theme on their home base. So I think, but you can absolutely put other mentors from other institutions that bring specific expertise, for sure.
R03s and R21s are small projects, 2 years. You don't necessarily need preliminary data, but they are just as competitive as an R01, so you don't want to say, oh, it's smaller, I should be able to get it. Yes?
Because of the payment part for the last bullet point for the K award, and us being in emergency medicine, I guess like how you are talking to your chair? They probably want you to get a bar, I'm guessing, is that?
So that's a huge question. I think maybe we should address it at 4 p.m. since we have 1 minute left. But this is an issue. The government wants you to spend 75% of your time in research and then pays you for about 50% of your time. And your institution has to eat the difference, or you have to find some way to make it work. So in that, for that reason, chairs, if they think you can get an R, they would much rather you get an R. And to be perfectly honest, as you'll see at tomorrow's R01 panel, there are people who very successfully do that. They skip the K and go for the R for lots of reasons. And so you have to figure out what's best for you. We've gone different routes. I don't think we're going to get through all the slides, but I'll go through a little bit further. So an R34 is a 2 to 3 year planning grant that you use to get you to that R01. Esper, and this one is if you're partnered with business. And then this one is actually sort of like an R34 plus an R01. So if you're thinking about an R34, you should look into the UG3 mechanism because it's sort of all built together where you do the planning and then you meet some milestones and then you get your R01. But not every institute has this mechanism. So I submitted an R34 recently and then I was all mad at myself for not doing a UG3, but I went back and looked and their UG3 was not available. So I had to do the R34. So it happens. So developing a team, you know what, next year I think we'll just do a whole didactic on developing a team because I think there's a lot to talk about that we're not going to get into, but I think is an important part. One resource I want you guys to know about is NIH Reporter if you haven't used it. It's like one of the most frequently Googled things on my phone. For example, I used it just now because I realized Faheem did not toot his own horn, and he mentioned his K, and then he didn't mention his R01, and I was like, no, this guy has an R01. Why did he not mention that when he introduced himself? I was like, let me just double check. Yeah, he has an R01. So you put in the name of the person that you're curious about. Here we put in Dr. D'Onofrio, who has lots of different things. You want to see what your keynote speaker's been up to? She was a keynote a couple years ago. You plug her in, you see all of her grants. But what you need this for is looking at who is doing similar work to you and what have they done. So I'm a shared decision-making researcher. I want to look into disparities. Who are the people who have done disparities work in shared decision-making, and what are they doing? And then, frankly, if you know them or if you don't know them, you can reach out to them and see if they're appropriate to be on your team because these people are, A, they know how to get funding, and B, they know how to do the research that you want to do. The other way that you can use this is this was a person, Dr. Liu, who I read a paper on, and I was like, oh, this paper is great. It was an implicit bias training. If I want her as a co-investigator, I want to know what grants she has that are active. So I just NIH Reporter her, and then I see what her grant is and what she's working on, and then I say, this is a great person to be a co-I, not only because of the paper, but also because of what she's doing in terms of funding, and then I reach out to her. So this is how you snoop on your colleagues and figure out who your team's going to be. I think we got to wrap up and let people go.
For questions, some of us will. Anna, you have to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we have any other, what's our wrap up? We're over time. Thanks for coming. Ask us questions. Check out the R01s, the Ks and all that, and let us know what we should do differently next time.